This week, we are talking about social identity theory. Social identity theory provides the basis for the rest of the theories that we'll be discussing this semester. Social identity theory was developed in 1979 by Henri Tajfel and John Turner. SIT, which is the acronym for social identity theory, asks two major questions. First, how do we define ourselves? And second, how do we achieve and maintain a positive evaluation of our identities? We've discussed this behavioral continuum throughout the semester, but social identity theory discusses this more explicitly. This behavioral continuum has interpersonal communication on one end and intergroup communication on the other. Interpersonal communication is determined by individual characteristics with no influence from social groups. So interpersonal relationships, that's what you discuss in Comms 244. And that means that our social groups, our culture, our religion, all of those cultural groups play no role in your communication and your relationships. On the other side of the continuum, you have intergroup communication, which is characterized by group boundaries and are not influenced by interpersonal traits or relationships. So intergroup communication goes back to those in-groups and out-groups. SIT explains that there are certain conditions that predict social behaviors nearing one of the extremes. So there's certain situations in which you're going to be closer to the interpersonal end and certain conditions where you'll be closer to the intergroup end of the continuum. But pure forms of these extremes are rarely found in social interactions. They're not never found, but rarely found. A situation where they may be found on one end or the other end is intergroup conflict. So when we are in intergroup conflict, like war, it may be strictly intergroup, but we'll talk more about conflict in a few weeks. So the assumptions of SIT. Let's go back to the first question that SIT asks. How do we define ourselves? Or how do I establish my identity? SIT says that we define ourselves by our social group memberships. So the groups that we belong to are the ways that, the groups that we belong to influence our identity. So you need to think about what social groups do you belong to, because the social groups that you belong to establish your identity. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The second question that social identity theory poses is, how do we achieve and maintain a positive social identity? So we do this through social comparison as we are motivated to establish positive distinctiveness. Positive distinctiveness is the process of achieving and maintaining a positive evaluation of our identities. So for instance, comparing to other individuals, I am better because my group is better. That is establishing positive distinctiveness. So social identity theory says, if we go back a slide, that we define ourselves by social group membership. So each of our social group memberships is either positively or negatively evaluated. And so we have to maintain positive distinctiveness regardless of whether our group is positively or negatively evaluated. And so SIT lays out several different ways that people try to maintain positive distinctiveness, especially if their group is negatively evaluated. So, why do people engage in intergroup discrimination? This is a question that social identity theory is very involved in. So as we've talked about, categorization of our world is natural, inevitable human instinct because we are serving to simplify our environment. We live in an overly complex world and we aim to simplify our environment. So we categorize ourselves and others into groups in-groups and out-groups, groups that we belong to and groups that we don't belong to. So seeking positive distinctiveness for one's in-group becomes an explanation for holding negative beliefs and attitudes about out-groups, which leads to prejudice and discrimination. So think about this in the context of Jayhawks. So we are all KU students. So we want to seek and maintain positive distinctiveness for our in-group of KU Jayhawks. And that becomes an explanation for holding negative beliefs towards K-State students. And that influences our attitudes about the outgroup of K-State students, and ends up leading to prejudice and discrimination. It leads us to saying negative things about K-State students. It leads us to say that we are better than them. So it's all in an effort to build up our own in-group. And so what are the consequences of that social comparison? Ethnocentrism, negative stereotypes, negative intergroup prejudice and attitudes, discrimination, racism, all of the things that we've talked about this semester. Think about our conversation on social categorization. Think about our conversation about perceptions and challenges to successful intergroup communication or intercultural communication. These are all the consequences of social comparison, of trying to build up my in-group by explaining the out-group as worse than me. These are all the consequences of doing that. So this is an example. Our Blessed Homeland, this group on the left of your screen, this group is the in-group. They have a glorious leader, great religion, a noble populace, and heroic adventures. The out-group are the barbarous wastes. Their leader is a wicked despot. Their religion is primitive superstition. They are backward savages, and they're brutish invaders. So if you look at this picture, this illustration, the only difference is that their flags are orange and our flags are purple. There's no difference between the two, other than the orange flag people are out-group members. So in an effort to make ourselves seem blessed, glorious, great, and noble and heroic, we have negatively evaluated the out-group members. And that's what social identity theory says that we do about other people. And think about how we do this during sports, right? There's really no difference between KU students and some other school students, K-State, Mizzou, but when we play a game of basketball or football, we are so ready to call them barbarous. We are so ready to call them primitive or backward or brutish, just like in this example, because it's a consequence of social comparison in order to build up our in-group and negatively evaluate our out-group. So, how do groups respond to marginalization? What do we do when we are negatively evaluated by a different group? So, for some social groups, particularly marginalized or minority groups, the ability to perceive positive distinctiveness is constrained or made difficult by social prejudice and discrimination. So social identity theory suggests that people respond in several ways based on individual and group belief systems. So we're going to talk about three of them. The first option is social mobility. So social mobility is essentially leaving one in-group for a different, more socially valued in-group. So this is likely to happen when group members have little sense of identification with their group. So if you don't really care about belonging to that group, you might change to a group that's more socially valued or positively evaluated. When boundaries between groups are permeable, so if it's relatively easy for you to move from one group to another, unconstrained by visible or other signs of group membership. So think about those voluntary group memberships. You can use this for voluntary group memberships, not for involuntary. And also when the intergroup hierarchy is viewed as relatively stable and legitimate. So this is when your in-group's marginalized position is probably not going to change. And this is an individual level strategy, not group-based. So this is not going to make any difference on how your group is viewed. You are just going to change your group membership. People may also adopt a social change belief system. So this drives people to act collectively as a group to challenge the status quo and raise the position of their in-group within the social hierarchy. So rather than abandoning their group for a more desirable outgroup, they instead attempt to make their in-group's position more desirable. So this is likely to happen when group members have high identification with an in-group, you care a lot about this group membership, the boundaries between groups are impermeable. So this is an involuntary group membership. You are not able to change it because the signs are probably visible. Your race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And the status quo is perceived to be unstable and illegitimate. So you perceive the reason for your group being marginalized is wrong, and you as a group believe that you can change it. So some examples of people using social change belief system are Black Lives Matter in the United States and globally right now. US civil rights in general, we saw this and we continue to see this with disability rights movements. A lot of groups that you cannot change that you belong to this group, but you see this as the status quo must change. So that's a social change belief system. And that is a collective strategy. So that will change the evaluation for your whole group, not just for you as an individual. And a middle ground strategy is social creativity. So this is when a group might find alternative dimensions on which they can compare themselves to an outgroup. So if your group is negatively evaluated, you might say, we're not as powerful, but we are more creative. So this is really a communication-based strategy because you're going to be creative and you're going to be strategic about the way that you communicate about your group. So a group might find alternative outgroups to serve as comparisons, and this may lead marginalized groups to compete against each other rather than against the dominant group. So this may lead one negatively evaluated group to say, oh, well, we may be bad, but we are better than this other negatively evaluated group. So this is considered a middle ground strategy because it's really kind of a, it's not a long-term solution. So this theory can be applied to your paper number 1, Understanding Social Identity Theory in the Media. So understanding the media from this theoretical perspective requires considering institutional processes and communicative activity. So the media embodies and represents the social hierarchy of group status, and media ownership helps us understand how individuals relate to the media in intergroup and intercultural terms. So your textbook talks about ownership, and ownership does matter in the way that groups are represented. So minority-owned media are more likely to include portrayals of minority group members, feature news and other content of interest to minority group members, and overall support the identities of minority groups and individuals. So when you're thinking about your 2 sources that you're going to think about for your media message project, you may want to think about the ownership. So is one of them owned by a minority-owned media and one is owned by majority or dominant culture? Because that may change the portrayals of minority group members. So how are groups portrayed? Marginalization of social groups happens in 2 primary ways in the media, through underrepresentation and negative representation. So underrepresentation, that means that marginalized groups or negatively evaluated groups are just not portrayed. You don't see people of color on television. You don't see people with disabilities on television. They're just not there. And the second way is negative representation. So representing them in negative ways, and both are harmful. So what are social identity related media effects? For members of marginalized social groups, media can support their identities by providing positive models of their in-group and by modeling group activism, which supports a social change belief system. And for members of the dominant group, exposure to positive portrayals of marginalized group members can reduce prejudice toward the marginalized group. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about intergroup contact theory. So for members of marginalized social groups, negative portrayals can reinforce a sense that their in-group is devalued. And for members of dominant groups, exposure to negative portrayals of marginalized groups reinforces stereotypes and encourages negative attitudes toward that group. So what I want you to think about this week is how can you incorporate this theory in paper number 1 and to complete working on paper number 1. Have a good week.